Hello everybody, I'm really sorry that it didn't work out for us the other day. I hope that this video format is more accessible to everybody, and I'm looking forward to the discussions we can have afterwards. The title of this presentation is Intellectual, Affective, and Relational GCE Work. And it starts with some disclosures that I don't know if you... The title of this presentation is Intellectual, Affective, and Relational GCE Work. It starts with some disclosures about my work. Then we're going to have part one being about working in complex environments and translating GCE into different contexts and narratives, which is inspired by a lot of the questions you sent in advance. Part two is about gesturing towards new horizons of hope. We're going to be looking at some case studies that are part of a research project. In part three, we're looking at the framework that is called In Earth's Care as an example of a framework for global justice that looks both at intellectual and affective investments. So most of the work that is presented here, but not all of it, is available in text form in the article that is presented below, called Mobilizing Different Conversations about Global Justice in Education Toward Alternative Futures in Uncertain Times. And the article is available online. You just need to Google it. So in terms of disclosures, there are several narratives that I can use to describe my work, but recently I have been using one that says that my work is concerned with humanity's capacity and lack of capacity to figure out how to get out of a mess it has created, a mess that jeopardizes its own survival. And that my work and the work of my collective of researchers, artists, educators, and activists assumes that this is not fundamentally a problem of knowing that can be fixed with more information, but a problem of a habit of being, of restrictive, cognitive, affective, and relational contextual wirings or configurations affecting our neurobiology and functionality. So in other words, we need to change the motherboard, not just the apps, of the ways of being that we are used to. Another metaphor we use in the projects that I'm involved with is the metaphor of a tree, where you have ways of doing and ways of evaluating represented by leaves, ways of reasoning and substantiating represented by branches, ways of seeing and saying represented by a trunk, the visible part of the trunk, the invisible part of the trunk going into the roots are represented by ways of wanting and feeling. And then ways of sensing, yearning, and relating are the tips of the roots or the point of contact between the root and the earth. So the idea here is that most of the intellectual work that we do in institutions and in education relates to ways of doing and evaluating and ways of reasoning and substantiating. But a lot of the work that needs to be done from this perspective is related to ways of seeing and saying and what the limits are of the trunk and what's unintelligible to the trunk, for example, and ways of wanting and feeling. So all the desires, both harmful desires, distractive desires that we have, traumas, and basically we talk about the idea of individual and collective shit that we have to process and compost in order to transform it into soil so that something else can be regenerated out of that. So we talk about this big constipation that represents our inability to deal with our individual and collective pain and the need for developing strategies that involve the body and involve other senses for us to be able to process the lessons that we need to learn from our times in order to be able to renew or our ways of being or hospice old ways of being and assist with the birth of something new, undefined and potentially, but not necessarily wiser. So the work about ways of seeing and saying and ways of wanting and feeling is the focus of the kind of work that I do. I've been framing now my work in relation to 7 practical questions and 7 more existential questions. I'm going to show you today the 7 practical questions. So I'm involved in several collaborative artistic and academic inquiries related to the following intriguing puzzles, and these are the practical questions. 1, why is it that we as human species are choosing to wreck the planet we depend upon for survival? 2, why do we choose, more often than not, the path that leads us to demean, exploit, enslave, hurt, and kill other species, and in times of instability, even our own? Why do we choose to build nations and empires on the broken backs of our relatives? Why is it that we don't want to hear about our complicity in harm? Why is it that we prefer to hear about things that make us feel good or hopeful, that we can still keep our comforts when we know this is unsustainable? Why aren't we asking more difficult questions? Why don't we have the stamina to dig deeper? Why do our questions and solutions keep reproducing the same ways of knowing and being that created the problems in the first place? What educational processes have the potential to, number 1, override our neurobiological wiring, our fears, our self-interest, our narratives, our ego, our narcissistic tendencies, our traumas? Then activate a visceral sense of entanglement, responsibility, humility, generosity, compassion, and openness that is not dependent on will or intellectual choices. And open up possibilities or worlds that are viable but unimaginable or inarticulable within our current frames of reference and desire. What possibilities would be open if our thinking and action were not driven by systemic fears, insecurities, traumas, attachments, and destructive desires? And finally, how do we as educators engender a form of responsibility that is not an intellectual choice based on values, especially at these times where people change their cognitive investments in a much more fluid way than they used to do in the past, for example? Or a decision that is dependent on will based on what is convenient, or something coercive, but a visceral precognitive imperative. So how to engender a form of responsibility that is before will and that is precognitive? How do we change our bodies, our neurobiology, so that responsibility is no longer a choice, but it's something that we just do without thinking? So that is the bigger aim of what I'm trying to figure out with a group of people. So coming from this set of questions, this is you will see that what I offer to you today is going to be probably a bit different from what other groups working with different sets of questions are going to offer. And we're not trying to sell this as the only thing that is needed in the field, but I think there is an assumption here that this has been overlooked for a long time and may give us different kinds of insights of what to do in education. So in relation to part 1 now, the idea of translating GCE into different contexts. Here you have, again, another analogy or metaphor, depending on your definition of metaphor. This could be an analogy or a metaphor. So I'm not going to go there. So this is a beach, and there's a person splashing and afraid of going into the water. There's a person floating, a person ducking, and a person diving. And in my collective, we have developed questions in relation to each of these states of engaging with the water. And the water here is represented by global citizenship education. So those who are splashing are just starting to engage with the field. They generally need more reassurance, and they need just the basics, right, to be able to feel that they have some grounding to engage, to start becoming wet and going into the water, into the cold water. Those who want to float are those who want to figure out solutions that can work in multiple contexts. They are looking for like the perfect lesson plan or a perfect technique that will motivate people and get people engaged, and that has been tried and tested and that is always successful. And there are lots of people in the splashing and floating mode. Most of the work with teachers, for example, would be looking for these strategies. A lot of the work with the public is about just explaining what we're talking about, which is the splashing. And those of us who have been in the field for a little bit longer and stayed in the field might want to duck into dive. So ducking is exploring the complexities of the field, because the field is very diverse. There are more critical strands of global citizenship education, less critical strands, more existential, more political. You can map it in several different ways. And there's no one technique or one strategy that will work in every context. And every time that we have something working in a successful way in one context, if you look deeper into it, it also is problematic. It's not going to be, the more you look, the more you will find things that are not necessarily they don't really satisfy. For example, that sometimes it doesn't satisfy a political craving or a critical craving or an existential craving. So we're still learning about this, right? So people who are ducking, they're looking at the complexities, but still like a little bit cautious of engaging in murky waters and then becoming unintelligible, or then not having other people to work with and being isolated. And this is a difficulty of the field itself, how to create spaces where people can engage with the complexities in the paradoxes without feeling lost, right, or losing intelligibility. And then there are those who are diving, who are already experimenting and exploring without having the restrictions sometimes of institutions, or they have found institutions where they can go and explore and are not afraid of failure, or are working with the difficulties without the need or the pressures of producing results that fit a specific funder's idea of what we should be doing, right? So we talk about divers as those working with impossibilities, really at the edge of beyond already what we consider to be possible, and pushing it. And the idea here is that in an ideal scenario, we would have spaces for people to do all of this, and to be able to dive and bring something back that can be translated into the splashing, the floating. And we could have communities that could duck together and dive together, and the floaters would be told, okay, this is what you start with, but it's not going to be perfect. And then there's an invitation into ducking and diving. So there would be a trajectory from splashing, floating, ducking and diving, and then back in translation, right? So that we could have a field where all these different levels and depths of engagement are possible. In practice, in NGOs and in institutions, this is difficult to achieve, because generally what we're doing is driven by demand, right? And the demand from ducking and diving is an internal demand from the field, rather than a demand of funders or of the wider public, right? That is asking us to make things more basic and intelligible. So this is a struggle, an internal struggle of the field that we have to figure out how to work with. But I'm really happy that Bridge 47 actually created the project that you're in order to encourage ducking and diving. In my view, I might be wrong about that too, but the idea of innovation is to get to a level of complexity and depth that is generally not possible when you are in the hustle of applying for funding every 3 years or having to meet other demands. But again, ducking and diving makes sense when you can translate these things for ourselves and for others, when we have a community where we can share this learning, and when this learning is also producing new forms of engagement in other areas. So part of my answers to your questions was that we need to be able to realize when it's the time to work with the space or the audience that we're working with, that we have to have different narratives. So in a narrative that invites people into more depth. So I've been talking about GCE as digging deeper and relating wider, like digging deeper into the relationships that have been established within modernity or within capitalist modernity, and seeing the problems of how we are interdependent with others in harmful ways. We are reproducing harm, and what else is possible, but relating wider in the sense of expanding the scope of possibilities for us to relate and take responsibility for things, working with that level of the affective and the desires that we have, and being able to deal with pain in very different ways, and face our fears, and work with the complexities and the paradoxes of things. So this is the first thing I would like to say about it, that we have to be able to have different narratives and work with different audiences, and have the space to not make it all coherent, because this is not about coherence, but have a more probably complex approach to our own work, so that we can keep the integrity not so much in a single message, but in meeting different needs, and inviting into more depth and a greater scope of relationships. So that's the first one. The second thing about translating GC into different contexts is related to this other cartography that looks into different understandings of change. And the first one is soft reform, where we focus on doing, so the leaves of the tree, and in terms of policies, changing practices, and changing the values so that individuals can change their behavior. And there's a hope for continuity of the single story of progress, development, and human evolution that is normative, that is kind of the water we breathe as fish in the pond, and we don't really realize that we have this idea of a single forward, because this is being fed us by the institutions and by the media and by our relationships. From soft reform to radical reform, there's a recognition of that there are dominant ways of knowing that are limited, and that silence other ways of knowing. So there's a questioning of the single story and a hope for an expansion. So instead of soft reform, it's radical reform. There's a change here of power relations in order to include more people and more perspectives. And the hope here is for fixing and expanding the same system, so that it's more colorful. And then from that to the next idea of change, there's a recognition that it's not just the way of knowing that is problematic, it's also the way of being. And here we have beyond reform. So it's not soft or radical, we need a different system. So a change of a way of being and coexisting is necessary, and there's a hope for other systems, for adjacent possibilities. And here it's more complex than just what's presented here. But I decided to put this slide in to say that in the work that I do with institutions and with other collectives outside of institutions, it's generally, so for example, in institutions, between soft and radical reform. I have to be translated. For those who only understand soft reform, I need to be pushing for more radical reform. In those who are doing radical reform and seeing the paradoxes of it, I introduce beyond reform. But this is not a linear progression here. All these realms and ways of thinking about change are problematic. And my job as an educator is the job of a translator, is to show the differences and the tensions and the paradoxes and the complexities, and invite people to go into more depth in engaging with these things, rather than encouraging the consumption of knowledge, of experience, or of relationships so that they feel good about something. My job is to take them away from that desire for feeling good or for looking good into feeling supported and joyful in digging deeper and learning to relate wider. And in order to do that, I have to be very cautious about this translation work and attentive to the needs of different people. So I think somebody asked, one of the questions was about what words do we use to describe this work? And it depends. It will depend on what's intelligible in each context. So generally for institutions in soft reform, sometimes global citizenship is the starting point, and I'll go there. And I'm not going to try to convince them that global citizenship is good or bad. It's part of their symbolic world. And I say, okay, this is what we're talking about. You use it to create a relationship, right? And then you push it to where you want it to be more critical. You raise questions of ethics, and you engage in that symbolic realm, bringing them into contact with other possibilities of digging deeper and relating wider. Sometimes it's through global citizenship, sometimes it's sustainability, sometimes it's global interdependence, sometimes it's social innovation that starts the conversation. The idea here for translators is that words do not have meaning in themselves, that words have contextual meaning, and we need to be able to mobilize meaning, make this meaning move in other directions so that people open up new possibilities of doing, of thinking, of seeing, of wanting, and then ultimately of relating. And there are days where I'm working with soft reform in the morning, radical reform in the afternoon, and beyond reform in the evening on a Skype with somebody in India, for example. And that's just how it is. It's not something that that I can't change and say, no, everything needs to be one message and it needs to be coherent. It's always a relational process that you engage with people where they're at, but there's no like we go from A to B. We just go deeper and wider. That's the idea, my idea of translation in terms of GCE. Now, that map that you saw over there is coming from it's a simplification of another map that is partly represented here of soft reform, radical reform, and beyond reform, so that you have an idea of how more complicated that is, right? So especially if you look at the radical reform space in this new picture, you will see racism, capitalism, colonialism, heteropatriarchy, and nationalism there, and there are more things there. For example, neurotypicality, there, ableism, speciesism, there that are also yellow dots, right? Plus more. And generally in radical reform, people take up one or two of this and go with it and tend to either overlook or engage at a lesser intensity with the rest. And then you have these struggles being pitched against each other sometimes, which makes the conversations very difficult. And that's where, when these tensions arise, that's where people open up to another possibility of beyond reform. So that translation happens when we reach the limits of trying to include everything and everybody. And sometimes it becomes a question of entitlements against entitlements and who is the most oppressed, and very difficult and painful issues that we have to be able to have a conversation about, but these conversations are extremely load charged, right? And generally they lead to relationships falling apart. So I'm working with that on that edge, and in terms of how to have these conversations in different ways and how to open up to the beyond reform space in ways that we understand that some people are trying to replace the system, so they are looking for alternatives with guarantees. Other people are trying to hack the system. Other people are trying to hospice the system. And there's even more alternatives beyond that are unintelligible to us at this point. So if you're interested in that, I do encourage you to have a look at the paper called Mapping Interpretations of Decolonization in the Context of Higher Education, where this map is explained in more detail. So now going to the second part of the presentation, I'm going to be presenting a few case studies, 2 case studies of a project that I have in relation to the Beyond Reform space. So Beyond Reform is not necessarily a normative place to get to, but a place that we have to pay attention, because these are the people who are trying things out at the edge and one little step outside of the system, and what they learn there, especially from failure, is extremely important for us as we face the storm, right, that is happening in the system itself. So what I argue now in GCE is that it is learners' right, like children's rights, to it's their right to be able to see that there are people trying something very different. Also because in Brazil we have this proverb that says that in a situation of a flood, when the water is rising, it's only when the water reaches your waistline or your bum that you are able to swim. So before that, you can only walk. So for those who have the water reaching already their waist, or who have been swimming for a long time, it is a very different context, right? And we can learn from them. We can learn from the swimmers. So the idea in the Beyond Reform is to look for the swimmers and see what they're doing, how they've learned, what obstacles they face, what paradoxes and complexities and challenges they face. Not to create this narrative about this romanticized and idealized other way that we should all go to, but actually to learn and be taught by this process, this struggle, right? And to open up the imagination and remember that swimming is possible, that we can, our capacities are beyond what we can imagine. So remember the house of modernity, the house exiles capacities. So we have to tap the capacities exiled by the house to be able to even want something different from the house. So we were trying to create stories that were complex stories, not romanticized stories, of projects that set horizons of hope beyond 3 out of 5 of these things. So we were looking for case studies that had at least 3 of the things that are facing here, that are listed here. So the horizons of hope needed to be set beyond capitalism, socialism, and anarchism, beyond nation states as a primary unit of social cohesion, beyond anthropocentrism and separation between humans and nature, beyond single stories and rationalities as a way of uniting people politically, and beyond social mobility as the purpose of life. And we were looking at these things, in relation to the end of the world as we know it. So we were looking for projects that were talking about the end of the world as we know it, but the end of the world as we know it not being the end of the world. It's just the end of a way of knowing and being in the world. So this, in relation to these 5 criteria for horizons of hope, we were also looking at the implicit or explicit critique. So in terms of the economy, if the horizon of hope is set beyond capitalism, socialism, and anarchism, we were looking whether or not there was an implicit critique of racialized expropriation and exploitation of humans and the earth in the production of commodities for capital accumulation. In terms of governance or the wall of the house, if the horizon of hope was set beyond nation states as primary unit of social cohesion, if there was a critique of artificial and militarized and securitized borders that primarily protect property. So the nation state as an institution that was created to protect property rather than people. In that sense, this is a critique that comes from critical race theory, that the nation state only protects people when there is a convergence between the interests of protecting property and capital and protecting people. So we were looking at whether that critique was there. Then in terms of politics and single stories and rationalities, we were looking for the implicit critique of the social polity being independent on shared ideologies or the desire to describe the world, to control it. In terms of purpose or the stairs of the house, if the horizon of hope is set beyond social mobility as a purpose of life, if there was an implicit critique of metropolitan consumerist individualism representing the ideal society. And last but not least, because this is actually the most important in terms of existence, the foundation of the house, we were looking if the separation between humans and nature was what the horizon of hope was set beyond, if there was an implicit critique of our alienation from the ecological wider metabolism that we belong to, and if there was a critique of Earth and humans becoming property or becoming capital, that then is the basis of the creation of hierarchies of value production. Basically here, the assumption is that, like, if we separate ourselves from the land, if there is this cut between humans and nature, this separation, what is stripped away from us is the idea of the intrinsic value of our lives. So we feel worthless and we feel we don't deserve being alive. We have to prove to others why we should be alive, and then we have to produce value in modern economies, right? In order to be able to get the external validation that you are worth something. And that would be the foundational primary problem that we are facing in the current state of affairs. So if we don't go back there, and that's something that both socialism, capitalism, and anarchism still, it's the trunk, right? It's part of the trunk of the tree. So then socialism, capitalism, and anarchism would be different branches of the same trunk. The ways of seeing the world, seeing us as separate, and communicating through single rationalities as a way to create community that then is governed by the protection of property, and that then becomes a process of creating this upward mobility based on expropriation and exploitation. So back to the case studies, we were looking for case studies that had 3 out of the 5 things that you have there. They were challenging 3 out of 5. And one of the case studies is the case study of Pachamama Project. And here are the principles. This is put here just as an example. There are more principles. This is just for us to have a look at the possibilities. So this project, it started as an educational project. Now it's an education and health project in Peru, in Pinchek, near Pisac. I've been involved with this for about 18 years. And so principle 1 says that the entire planet, Earth, and Pachamama is my whole home and country. My country is my mother, and my mother knows no borders. So this statement shows that the horizon of hope lies beyond nation states, and there is a critique of the securitized borders. Number 2, we are all brothers and sisters, humans, rocks, plants, animals, and all others. So they go beyond anthropocentrism, not making a distinction between us and the earth. The answers are in each of us, but it's difficult to listen when we are not in balance. So this is part of, I would put it as part of beyond the single story. The priority for life and education is balance, and the purpose is to learn, and learn again. So beyond the single story, because this learning doesn't necessarily happen in a linear way. It's a circular and spiral thing. There's no complete knowledge. We all teach, learn, and keep changing. It's a path without an end. Again, it's not teleological. It's beyond a single story. And then the world is changed through love, patience, enthusiasm, respect, courage, humility, and living life in balance, which comes with recognizing we're different manifestations of each other. So beyond social mobility as the purpose of life, beyond the separation between us and the earth. The other example here is the Shikshantar Declaration of Decolonial Education. I think that's what they call it, which says that I can no longer accept a narrative of education that teaches me that my village grandmother was illiterate, primitive, backward, stupid, uneducated, underdeveloped, uncivilized, and not capable of managing her own affairs. So, very strong critique of the single story of progress, development, human evolution that sees the grandmother as backward. That links my to my land, local languages, seeds, rivers, trees, histories, and her stories, body, inner voice, to the spirit world, and to my community are all barriers to modernization and development, which must at best be destroyed if we are to progress, or at worst be condemned to a multicultural day festival in school. Again, critique of the single story of progress and of anthropocentrism. That physical work in the fields, in my home, and in my community is drudgery, and that the definition of happiness lies in drinking Coca-Cola, eating McDonald's, using fair and lovely face whitening creams, and chatting on Facebook. So again, consumerist, individual, metropolitan consumerist individualism is the problem here. And that I have to compete against others in my community and against peoples from other countries to survive capitalism, and that learning is a commodity along with the air, water, land, and food, and that knowledge is the property of individuals through copyrights and patents. So Manish Jain was one of the people who spoke in the film, the documentary Schooling the World, which is a wonderful educational resource. It's also problematic in the way that the director chose to present the perspectives. But if you engage with it critically, it can also open up different possibilities for thinking about education. So these two examples we use in this research project to show that it's possible to think beyond the house. But it's difficult to be beyond the house, right? So the Pachamama Center, because it's run by indigenous people that are committed to maintaining a layer of their own relational ways of knowing at the same time that they engage in capitalism as well. I think the difference is that for me in these 18 years learning from them is that I see them engaging with capitalism without being determined by it. So they have another ground for their security of being. So their security of being doesn't come from the certainty of knowing or the accumulation of resources. It comes from somewhere else, from a very, very special and deep connection with the earth itself and with everything else in it. And there are reasons for that I'm exploring with my research group in terms of inviting us also into these different possibilities of finding security somewhere else, not necessarily in the things that are promised by the House of Modernity. So, in order to conclude, I'm going to go back to the tree and just trying to simplify the idea here in terms of at the top of the tree we have doing. That's the first layer that we feel that needs to be changed, and then beyond, underneath doing, there's thinking. But underneath thinking, there is being. So, and that's the layer of being that's the most difficult to shift. We can shift thinking and get people to say what we want them to say and think differently. But if we don't change being, our ways of wanting and feeling, sensing, yearning, and relating, the thinking and doing tend to be just creating more branches for the same trunk, or becomes very circular, right? And then we tend in consumptive, like people are now consuming knowledge, relationships, and experiences for the same kinds of desires, for validation, for looking good, for feeling good, for accumulation, for all the depletions that this consumer culture creates, all the void, right? then there is all this consuming movement. And then the question is, what can interrupt this addiction to consumption? And that is a question of a habit of being, not necessarily something that is related to thinking. Like in addiction, we generally can't think our way out of it. That it's an embodied thing. We would have to engage other methods as well. So I'm interested in that, very interested in experiential education, especially education that invites us to process our traumas in both collective and individual, and that shifts the relationship that we have with the pain, especially in relation then to the divisions between groups and people and questions of identity and inequalities, systemic inequalities that are created around these categorizations, right? So these are difficult conversations we have to have, but we have to find a way that we have these conversations without relationships falling apart, and that we manage to learn how to relate beyond identity and beyond knowledge and even beyond understanding. So we have to relate in a much more visceral way. And learning from indigenous communities about the practices that they're still kept about these things is extremely important for me. So I don't think indigenous communities have the answers ideologically to the problems of modernity. I'm not going there for ways of thinking. I'm engaging with indigenous communities and going into immersive experiences to see what practices they have for keeping these visceral relationships nurtured, right? For shifting the ways we relate to the world at an embodied level, rather than for their opinion about the state of the world and propositions for solutions. I think this is interesting as well, but fundamentally, educationally, I'm very, very interested in the experiential strategies and techniques and practices that have been kept, that can help us see ourselves and very differently, and open up, activate other senses that that modernity might have numbed, so that we can start to want something else in relation to the world and in relation to each other and in relation to our own well-being. So in order to do that with a group of people, we have created a framework called Inner Earth Care, which centers the earth. And so the first thing is that instead of having one group in the middle and others in the margins, the idea is we take it, and then people fighting to be in the middle, we take everybody from the middle, we center the earth, and we recognize that the most invisibilized labor is the labor of the earth in keeping us alive. And in honor and in reciprocity to that relationship, we acknowledge our responsibility, basically, and we shift the metaphor. So when we talk about the critique, is the critique of the house of modernity, but when we talk about earth care, we use the idea of mycelium in mushroom. So mycelium is the biomass that when healthy, mushrooms are the fruit of that. And we use this metaphor to talk about 5 types of justice. Transformative justice, which is not redistributive justice or liberal justice or even what to call the other one. Okay, it will come back. It's another form. It's transformative justice, which is more related to well-being than it is to usual formal conceptualizations of justice. But we can talk more about that if you want later, if you have questions. So we say that ecological and economic justice are mushrooms that depend on mycelium, which is underneath the earth, or sometimes a little bit above it. And there are 3 justices that are represented in the mycelium: cognitive justice, affective justice, and relational justice. And basically the idea here is that if there's no cognitive, affective, and relational justice, there's no mushroom. And that's why we need to start from that. Cognitive justice is how we relate to different knowledges and ignorances. So there's an ecology of knowledges and ignorances, and this is based on the work of Boaventura de Souza Santos. It's also related to how we relate to the known, the unknown, and the unknowable, and how the unknowable, generally modernity, we're afraid of it, but how it has an enormous role in actually being the tangible thing that connects us to each other. Then there's affective justice, the need for neurogenesis, for us to figure out a way that this wider metabolism of emotions within us and outside can circulate and uh, find its way to be composted and create new soil for new relationships, basically dealing with our individual and collective shit. And then there's relational justice, which is about learning to relate beyond identity, knowledge, and understanding. So getting to that point where responsibility is not an intellectual choice, where we emanate generosity, compassion, and humility not as intellectual choices. Because if I say, okay, I'm being generous, you are probably not. Like, you can fake it until you make it, which is, I grant it, it's possible, but it cannot be a choice. It has to be, we have to find a space of being, an altered state of being, that where that can come without an effort, and without it being a choice that can be done out of convenience, right? It has to be something more visceral. So we use this framework to talk about different layers of doing, thinking, and being. So what would ecological justice in that sense look like in terms of doing, thinking, and being? And we ask organizations to say, okay, where are you in this whole table, and where would you like to be, and do you need support, do you need to connect with other people doing different things? And we link organizations doing, like, say, cognitive justice at a being level with people who want to do it, who are still at a doing level and want to get to another place. And we're still mapping this, figuring out how to establish this connection, so that we maybe in 10 years we would have a network of eco-social initiatives of education that could provide us with experiential learning in these areas, based on a curriculum that has depth and innovative thinking in relation to each of these dimensions of justice, basically. So that's it. I'm going to suggest to Tim a couple of different possibilities for us to continue this conversation. And I hope that I will be able to engage with the questions that you have, that will help me deepen the work and share this with other people. And yeah, I hope that the conversation continues. Here is the article that I mentioned in the beginning, where you will find a lot of was presented today. And I wish you all the best in your learning journeys, and I hope to hear from you very soon.